Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the story of Jesus. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in this lesson, we will focus on Thursday. Let's share the screen and go to the PowerPoint slides. Exodus chapter 12 tells us that the Feast of Unleavened Bread was a 7-day celebration designed to remember God bringing his people out of Egypt. Exodus chapter 12 also tells us about Passover. Passover was a one-night remembrance of the death angel passing over the homes of Israelites who were living in Egypt at that time if they had the blood of the lamb sprinkled on their doorframe. Well, these were distinct observances, but they were so closely connected that the entire week of Feast of Unleavened Bread was often just referred to as Passover, as was the case in Luke chapter 22, verse 1. This explains how Jesus could eat the Passover meal on Thursday night, but references still being made to the Passover occurring on Friday, as is the case in John chapter 18 and John chapter 19. Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22 tell us this, and this is the actual wording from Matthew 26:17. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat Passover?" And Jesus' answer was, "Go into the city, you'll meet a man, tell him you need to borrow his upper room, and then you gather the things that are needed, and we'll have the Passover meal on Thursday evening." Well, during the meal, not after the meal, but during the meal, Jesus established a new covenant. They were there to remember the Passover, but Jesus takes some of the unleavened bread, passes it around, says, "Take a piece of this and eat it, and use this to remember my body." And then he takes the wine and he passes it around and says, "Everyone take a drink of this and use this to remember my blood." In other words, he's saying, this is how you're going to remember the new agreement, the new covenant that's about to be put in place, not based on the blood of an actual lamb, but based on the blood of the lamb, referring, of course, to himself. Well, then we're told after the meal, they sang a hymn and then they left. Question is, where did they go? Did they go to the Mount of Olives, or did they go to the Garden of Gethsemane? In a previous lesson, we'd looked at a map showing the route that would bring you in from Bethany over top the Mount of Olives, down through the Kidron Valley, and up into Jerusalem. Well, in chapter 26 of Matthew, in verse 30, Matthew tells us that they went to the Mount of Olives. But in verse 36, he said they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. Same thing happens in Mark 14. Verse 26 says they went to the Mount of Olives. Verse 32 says they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke chapter 22 talks about the Mount of Olives. John 18 doesn't really mention either in particular. He says they went over the Kidron Valley where there was a garden. Well, the answer to the question is it was almost the same place. The Mount of Olives was the actual mountain, or what we might think of more as a hill. And at the base of that hill or mount was a garden, and it was known as the Garden of Gethsemane. And so the Mount of Olives, as the name suggests, was a place where there was a very large olive grove. And when the olives were ready to be picked, they would be picked and taken to the base of the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where the press was. And the olives would be put into the press, and that's where the olive oil would come from, and that's how the olives and the olive oil was harvested. Well, for our purposes, and of much greater significance than olive oil being produced, is that Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22. Once he was arrested, the arresting party took Jesus to the house of Caiaphas, where the religious leaders had gathered. And what's interesting is the religious leaders were already there. It's not as if they had to be called to the house of Caiaphas once Jesus had been arrested. It's almost as if they knew it was going to happen. this was going to occur. And so they had already gathered at the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest. John 18 actually tells us that Jesus was first taken to the house of Annas, then to the house of Caiaphas. Well, who was Annas? Annas had been the high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. Caiaphas became the high priest in AD 18. So there were a few years in between Annas and Caiaphas where there was a high priest, each of whom served for 1 year. But there were still some folks who were loyal, apparently, to Annas. And so John indicates that Jesus was taken to his house. But eventually they ended up at the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was one of the longest serving high priests during the Roman occupation. By the time of Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion, say in 32, 33 AD, Caiaphas had been the high priest for 14 to 15 years, and he would continue to be the high priest for another 3 to 4 years after that. Caiaphas, as the high priest, had religious duties, and the Old Testament tells us about the various things that he was supposed to do as the high priest. But it's important to note, as scholars have told us, that Caiaphas, as the high priest, also was a diplomat of sorts. He was perhaps an ambassador, if you like that word. He was the representative of the Jewish people to the Roman government. And what that meant was Caiaphas had to be politically savvy. And again, by the time of Jesus' trial and crucifixion, Caiaphas had been the high priest for 14 to 15 years. So he knew how the system worked, and he knew what he needed to do in order to get the outcome he wanted from the system. So the religious leaders tried to find something about Jesus that could be used to pronounce a death sentence, a judgment on him, but they couldn't. Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22 tell us that the testimony of the various people there at the house of Caiaphas was contradictory. It was inconclusive. They just couldn't seem to come up with anything that they could then take on to the Roman government and say, here's why Jesus should be executed. They finally settled on the charge of blasphemy. Jesus said he was the Son of God. And according to Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16, anyone found guilty of blasphemy was to be killed. Of course, verse 16 of Leviticus 24 says they're supposed to be stoned to death, but that was the charge the religious leaders came up with, blasphemy. Caiaphas had to know that wouldn't be enough. Now, it was enough for the religious leaders to be convinced that Jesus needed to die, but Caiaphas had to know that he was not going to be able to get a death sentence from the Romans. But that's the best he could do. That's the best they could come up with. So with that charge, they tied Jesus up and they paraded him to the Roman governor, a man by the name of Pontius Pilate. And that's where this lesson will end. In our next lesson, we will focus on the crucifixion. I hope you can join us.